Hello everybody. I'm going to be giving my reasons for why I don't think Bloodborne is a masterpiece, nor is it that close to being one in its current state, not that it's going to change anytime soon. Quick disclaimer, I want to say that this is not rage bait and that Bloodborne is my favourite game that I've ever played. Not that I've played hundreds of games, but I think that it being my favourite game of all time is pertinent information. So firstly, I'd like to briefly mention the hitboxes and how they can be extremely awkward and janky at times, which can lead to certain bosses being ruined or made significantly worse and less enjoyable to fight. For example, certain Ebrietas attacks, mainly talking about the charge attack, which I know there is ways to dodge, and I know most of them, but the fact that you have to go to such lengths, mainly because of the hitbox being quite inaccurate, is ridiculous and takes away from the enjoyment of the fight, in my opinion. There are quite a few other bad hitboxes, but I'm not going to go through them all. I just wanted to state that they are a bit of a downside to Bloodborne. Then there's camera issues for certain bosses, specifically talking larger bosses including Dark Beast Parl and Cleric Beast. These camera issues make the fight significantly more tedious than they really need to be, especially since the fights in themselves aren't particularly bad. It's just the camera, and yes, I do know that it can help to unlock the camera from the boss, but that doesn't help all the time. Now I want to talk about bosses and their overall quality and what makes them so-called difficult. One of the main problems for me personally is that a lot of the bosses, in my eyes, are extremely gimmicky. I never really paid attention to this until recently, but if you take into account how many of the bosses run off of extremely gimmicky concepts, you'll realize how many bosses have gimmicks, especially if you include multi-boss fights as a gimmick. I understand that you could technically call everything that makes a boss hard a gimmick, like the boss does a lot of damage or they attack quickly, but I would count those as more normal and fairer ways of making bosses hard, whereas gimmicks are much cheaper ways of making the boss hard, although they can be quite interesting and make a boss more memorable and fun in certain instances. Just to point out how many gimmick boss fights there are, I'm going to name all of the fights, not including chalice bosses, that I would classify as gimmicky. This includes multi-boss fights. Blood-Starved Beast, since his poison creates a gimmick. Witches of Hemwick, Shadows of Yharnam, Rom the Vacuous Spider, Celestial Emissary, Dark Beast Parl if you include his AoE attacks as a gimmick, The One Reborn, Amygdala, Mikolash Host of the Nightmare, Murgo's Wet Nurse, since she has the clone attack, which you can dodge, but I doubt anybody would figure out how to actually dodge that without searching it up or finding it out by accident, and lastly, the Living Failures. Now that takes up half of the total bosses in the entire game, which is quite the letdown, in my opinion, albeit I do still moderately enjoy a lot of those fights, but the gimmicks just make them feel less rewarding to kill for me personally. And a few things I want to quickly touch upon are boss runbacks and limited healing and bullets, since I know it's quite a controversial thing in the game. Firstly, the boss runbacks are tedious and annoying, which can make the game more of a chore to play than a fun activity. And for limited healing and bullets system, I enjoy it as a person who plays Bloodborne frequently, since it gives me a sense of satisfaction when I kill an enemy and they drop blood vials or quicksilver bullets. The finite amount of them actually makes them feel valuable and satisfactory to loot, but I do highly agree that it makes the game much more inaccessible to new and unexperienced players, since it makes consecutive boss attempts tedious and unfun. And one of the other things I want to speak about is the common enemy difficulty. You know, the kind of enemies you'll just find throughout the game in open areas and whatnot. First of all, a lot of the common enemy difficulty in this game comes from gang fights and so-called artificial difficulty. The enemies in themselves are not all particularly difficult, but the fact that there is multiple of them is what makes them difficult, which, in my opinion, is a cheap way to make them difficult, but with patience you can trivialize most areas by slowly clearing out the enemies, although understandably that's not fun for most people, especially considering the fact that it's very easy to get practically one shot if multiple enemies hit you at once, which leads to you having to clear out the entire area again, which obviously is not enjoyable.